Welcome to Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran Magazine and Vietnam Veterans of America, hosted by Arts Editor Marc Leepson. Each episode is a one-on-one interview with a writer, novelist, actor, director, or other artist whose work is influenced by the Vietnam War. In addition to appearing on the VVA Veterans Facebook page, archived episodes can be found on the magazine's webpage and on VVA's website. And now, let's begin.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 47 of Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran Magazine, coming to you live and on tape, as always, from Vietnam Veterans of America's national headquarters, right here in downtown Silver Spring, Maryland. Our special guest today is Joseph Houlihan, a former journalist, war correspondent, and TV producer, who today is a military history specialist at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution in Bath, England. We'll be talking today about Joe's newly released book, Vietnam on the Big Screen, How the Vietnam War Changed Hollywood, and about how he came to write it, how he researched it, and what he learned about Vietnam War films along the way. I have to say that the book covers a subject I have been extremely interested in for more than 40 years. I've seen scores of Vietnam War films, and I've written reviews of virtually every one of them that has come out since we started the Arts of War column in The Veteran back in 40 years ago, March of 1986. So it's a subject I care very much about, and I have to say that it was a pleasurable duty for me to read Joe's book. My review, which will be an extremely positive one, will appear in the upcoming May-June 2026 print edition of the VVA Veteran, and then go online on vvaveteran.org. Joe Houlihan comes to us today from the UK. Joe, congratulations on the book, and welcome to Dispatches.
Thank you ever so much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Well, let's jump right in here because, this subject is near and dear to my heart, and I could probably talk about any one of about a half a dozen movies in here for the whole time that we have allotted. But let's talk about. Let's get into it, and then we'll just go from there, see where things lead us. So, by the way, in my introduction, I just wanted to say I hedged a little bit about calling you a military history specialist. Your actual title is Governor for Military History. So, since the U.S. and the U.K. are, as someone once said, two nations divided by a common language, can you tell us what a governor is and fill us in on the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution?
Sure. I think that sounds like a typo, Mark. I'm actually called convener for military.
Oh, convener. Okay.
Yeah. The Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution has been going for 200 years in this city. It's almost as old as the United States. But it was set up in 1824, and its mission was to propagate education and learning. And lectures have been held at this institution for 200 years.
Whoa.
Now, my colleagues there run a number of different groups. We have talks 4 or 5 nights a week on everything from astronomy, science, nature, world affairs, politics, the arts. And several years ago, we were doing history talks, but there was a bit of a gap, I thought, for military history, which is one of the most popular areas. And I volunteered to start what they call convening that specialism, which basically means my job is to find speakers. I have a talk once a month. We've had some very prominent speakers. A lot of really top historians, military historians have visited us. And we do very well. We get very big audiences, and it's popular. So it's a lot of fun.
Okay. Sorry, Governor. I didn't mean to convene. Okay, cool. So I know you've written a lot on military topics over the years. So tell us how you landed on the idea for this book about Vietnam War films.
I guess a lot of it is to do with my formative years. I grew up, I was born in 59, so I'm 66 years old now. But some of my earliest memories of news bulletins when I was growing up, even in England, were of the Vietnam War. I have vivid images in my mind of footage coming back onto the news screens of the BBC or ITV in England. And so it was always there as part of my upbringing. There were 2 conflicts really that were in the background of any kid growing up in the late 60s and early 70s in England. One was Vietnam. The other one was what they call the Troubles in Northern Ireland. They were always on TV. As I got older, as I got into my teens, I just became interested in military history generally, but also very specifically in the Vietnam War, because I read a couple of really interesting books. One of them, in fact, you had the author on very recently, was A Rumour of War by Philip Caputo. And I also read some Tim O'Brien. I read Fields of Fire, which is a novel, but very much a biographical novel. And so I became immersed in that world. I was very interested in it. And then around about the time that what I call the golden age of Vietnam War movies started coming out, which would be from the late 70s onwards. By then I was kind of around about 20 years old, getting in late teens, early 20s. So it was probably a time in my life when they made a big impression. But I remember going to see these movies on the big screen, so often in Leicester Square in the centre of London, which is kind of like Times Square, and seeing them on big screens and being absolutely blown away by these movies. So I always had that interest in the back of my mind. I was interested in the military. I ended up becoming a reporter, a journalist, a newspaper journalist. But when I was applying for my journalist job, I was also applying to join the Royal Air Force. So I was kind of wanted to go one of two directions. As it happened, I got the journalist job first, so I went with that. And I was, being a rash and callow youth, I kind of had this ambition of being a war correspondent because I was very taken with Dispatches, the book, which made the business of being a war correspondent sound just really fun and exciting, as well as dangerous and whatever. But I kind of grew out of that, fortunately, so I never ended up doing that, but I did become a journalist. So I went, after 10 years as a journalist, I moved into television. I've done a lot of documentaries over the years, including many about the military. But always at the back of my mind, I was fascinated by the Vietnam War and also fascinated by the movies about the Vietnam War. And there was a thing that nagged at me, and it was this idea that from 1968, when the Green Berets, the John Wayne movie, came out, until 1978, when you had The Deer Hunter and Coming Home and The Boys in Company C, there was that 10-year gap where no major movie came out from the major studios about the Vietnam War. And that kind of struck me as odd. And when I looked into it, it became even more odd because I found that during the Second World War, while the fighting was going on, while Americans were fighting, Hollywood turned out 150 movies about that war. The Korean War, that 1950 to 53, while the fighting was going on, 22 movies came out about the war. Vietnam, just this one major movie. There were some minor ones, but we don't need to go into them. Now, when I've mentioned that to people, they said, oh, well, it's obvious. It was an unpopular war. To which my thought was, really, is that true? Because actually, it wasn't universally unpopular to begin with. And also since then, we've had unpopular wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which to some extent divisive, to some extent unpopular. While those wars were going on, movies still came out about the conflicts while the fighting was going on. So I became intrigued about what was it about Vietnam. And that was probably a long-winded answer, I'm sorry to say, but when I stepped back from full-time work as a TV producer, I finally had time to kind of explore this. And that's where the idea of the book came from.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned Dispatches, the book, because that's where we took the title of the series from.
Yeah.
That was one of the best Vietnam War books about the Vietnam War. I remember a journalist correspondent who covered the war, and he describes it as almost a novel because Michael Hare really just kind of went crazy, in what he described. What it shouldn't be taken literally, but nevertheless, kind of like Apocalypse Now in a way, where it's not really a Vietnam War movie, but it is, but it isn't, but it's metaphorical. Anyway, so on. So just a little aside there. So let's talk about your sources. So when you got ready to do this book, I know that you watched tons of movies, you read books of criticism, you interviewed people. Tell us a little bit about that, about your process, about how you went about doing it. I know you said you watched a lot of these movies back when you were younger, but fill us in on that.
Sure. And I've watched a lot of the movies already years ago, and it was fascinating to rewatch them and to see which ones stood up 40 odd years later and which ones felt dated. It was interesting to see that. And then in terms of interviewing, obviously I was looking at both the making of the movies, how those movies came to be made. So I wanted to talk to people involved in that side of the business. So I ended up talking to directors, actors, people involved in the movie side. But a really big deal with me was that I was absolutely keen to find out what Vietnam veterans thought of the movies, because it's all very well for me, a Brit, not a veteran, to watch these and have a view on them. It's all very well for movie reviewers, even the great name movie reviewers, to say what they think about them. They haven't been there. They weren't in the war. So I ended up speaking to a lot of veterans. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Mark, I contacted you and you were incredibly helpful to me, both in terms of your own experiences and in terms of putting me in touch with people. So I spoke to a lot of veterans from different aspects of the war, different branches of the armed services, and that really helped inform how I looked at the movies again. And then, as you say, there's a lot of movies that have been made about the Vietnam War. So I watched a lot of movies I hadn't seen before, including finding some gems. There's one, the 84 Charlie Moped. I hadn't been aware of that movie, and that was a terrific film. That was a real part of the process. But a lot of movie watching. My wife would come home and catch me watching a film again. Say, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just working, darling."
So let's talk about your main overriding theme, and that is that the Vietnam War films changed Hollywood, and particularly The Deer Hunter, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, Good Morning Vietnam, and 84 Charlie Mopic, which you mentioned. Can you, if possible, give a brief, rundown on how you came to that conclusion, which convinced me, by the way? And I just wanted to say one other thing about before you get to that. You mentioned earlier about the 68, the only movie made, the big movie about the war, came in 68. And, it's one of the things I've written about a lot, and that is how the Vietnam War is different from all other American wars. Yeah, all of our wars are different from each other, but in so many important and, crucial ways. And one of them was this, about the fact that, the United States, the World War II, the effort extended to Hollywood, as you just said. That did not happen in the Vietnam War. It's like it was a 180. So to read your analysis and conclusion that it changed Hollywood and even more, would you go into that? And also, sorry, one more quick thing. So was that in your head from the beginning, or did that come to you as you were doing the research and watching more and more films, et cetera?
Now, that came to me as I worked on it, as I started working on the book, because my starting point was, as I say, well, number one, really a fascination with the war and the movies about it. But number two, to try and explain this gap of, when Hollywood stopped making movies. But then when I looked at what came afterwards, after that gap, everything was so different. And, you rightly mentioned the John Wayne film. Well, let me answer the question about how do I think in simple terms. It's quite complex, and I go into a lot of different ways it changed Hollywood. But I think the simplest one is that in the two major wars where Hollywood was, you could count the First World War. Believe it or not, they made 7 movies about the First World War while that war was being fought, but they were all silent movies, But certainly in the Second World War, the Korean War, Hollywood knew what its role was. Or at least it seemed to know what its role was, which was that our boys are fighting at the other side of the world often, and they're fighting for American values against the values of tyranny. Whether you agree with that or not, I'll leave, certainly as regards Korea, I'll leave that up to the individual. But that was the perception. And Hollywood had no hesitation in joining the fray by doing what it does best and turning out kind of, frankly, gung-ho action films that showed Americans in a good light, that showed American troops and military people as the heroes, showed the enemy, whether they were the Imperial Japanese or the Nazi Germans, showed them as evil. And for the most part, there were exceptions and some nuance here and there, but by and large, they were fairly gung-ho, jingoistic, propagandistic films. And the same was happening in the UK. The British studios turned out British equivalents during the war as well.
Keely, Donahue, the rest of you guys, keep your eye on their highness so they don't try any rough stuff.
Don't try anything funny.
Belly to the ground, you babies! We better get up there.
No, we better keep an eye on these prisoners.
What changed with Vietnam, I think, is when the division within the country hadn't been there for those earlier wars. So quite early on, the anti-war movement was growing, even in the early 60s, even as early as sort of 64, 65, there were voices against American involvement in Vietnam. And that, I go into that in the book. I won't spend too long on it now, but it does reflect, I think, social changes. I think the conformism of the 50s was giving way to a different attitude in the 60s. I think I use the phrase in the book, what the children, the young people who grew up in the 50s with, when the American dream was theoretically available to everyone, when the country was buoyant and successful, whether because or despite that, they became the sort of rebels in the 60s who wanted to do things differently. Maybe that's just an inevitability of human nature. I don't know. But as things started to change and that division happened in the country, that made Hollywood back off. But also, what then happened in the war, with its, let's say, inconclusive end, it was effectively a defeat from the American perspective. They were forced to leave Vietnam in 1973. The country fell to communism entirely in 1975, as you know. And I think also some of the issues that came out during the war, issues like the My Lai massacre, severely dented what Americans thought about their own serving men and women, especially their men. I think from the Second World War and the Korean War, those guys were considered to be heroes. And no doubt during those wars, some appalling things were done, but they weren't talked about, they weren't public. That just stuff happens in war. The Vietnam War, it was all out there in the open. The American military early on made that decision to let journalists go everywhere, cover everything, which obviously they came to regret in time. But so what that did, it undermined, I think, this sort of simplistic perception of what a war is and what fighting men are. Even our own fighting men, even our own sons, can, in the right circumstances, or the wrong circumstances, I should say, they can become monsters as well. It's not just necessarily the enemy who are the monsters. So what that led to was when Hollywood looked again at the Vietnam War from the late 70s onwards, it led to a much more nuanced approach to what a war film is. You still will have movies made, and there's still plenty of lower budget kind of action flicks, good guys, bad guys, but suddenly a whole new raft of movies came out that approach things in a much more nuanced and subtle way. And in a simplistic terms, I would say their focus changed from the World War II focus of being brave guys winning against bad people, often against the odds, to the pain of war. And the pain of war can be physical, it can be psychological, it can be to the individual, it can be to the soul of the country. And I think Hollywood started to reflect that from the late 70s onwards, and you can still pretty much see it in every major war movie that comes out today.
Yeah. And that's just one aspect. I mean, you also cover the music aspect of how, what Good Morning Vietnam you point to as one of the films that, tell us about that.
Time to rock it from the Delta to the DMZ.
Yeah, again, up to and including the Green Berets, the John Wayne film from 1968, every war movie, you got a composer, you edited the movie together, and you've got a composer to look at the finished product and do a musical score. And they're great, some of them are great. And many of us who grew up in the 60s and whatever, we can remember the tunes of some great movies. What happened in the Vietnam War is, and it particularly, I think, started with Apocalypse Now, was the use of popular music, use of commercial tracks. And what was very clever about the use of this type of music in the war films was that this was the music that the guys were listening to during the war. So sometimes you would have the music used in scene. You'd have guys playing it, the actors listening to the music in their role as servicemen. But also you'd sometimes have it overlaid on top. But either way, you're reflecting the music of the time that the Vietnam War was being fought. In fact, to the extent now that if you go on your Apple Music or Spotify and just search for Vietnam War playlist, you will get all you get the Mamas and the Papas, Buffalo Springfield, Gimme Shelter by the Stones, Jimi Hendrix, All Along the Watchtower. They'll all come out, and actually it is a Vietnam War playlist in the sense that it is what the guys were listening to, I guess, and you can probably speak to this more than I can, but it's also the Vietnam War movie playlist because those songs got used again and again in multiple movies. And the most on-the-nose version of that was, of course, the Good Morning Vietnam, because it was as much about the music as anything else.
Yeah. Well, it was the first rock and roll war too, right? I mean, I know rock and roll wasn't really born until what, 55. So we were the rock and roll generation, and music was a big part of it. I was in the rear, and we had a PX, and we could buy nice Japanese, stereos, either reel to reel or actual discs, and we could buy tapes in bootleg tapes and play them. Plus, we had the radio. So to me, and of course, music is also a great sense memory. I mean, when you hear a song that you listened to back then in the war, and especially in a war when everything is like it's heightened, it just if it doesn't take you there, it takes you to a place you were there too. So I thought that was a good insight that you had.
Actually, an interesting contrast with earlier wars. During the Second World War, guys were listening to, certainly British troops. A famous war song from the English soldiers listened to was "Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover." They were all nostalgia and about remembering the folks at home. But obviously, when in Vietnam, because in the synchronicity of which is chicken and which is egg, at the same time as you had the Vietnam War going and protests to the Vietnam War, you had more general protest movements growing in the 60s, producing art in the form of music. So when the war was not going brilliantly in Vietnam, you had guys being able to listen to songs that seemed as if they were speaking to their predicament. Gimme Shelter. If you're there and you're going out every day on Search and Destroy and you're listening to Gimme Shelter, it's go figure. It's no wonder they resonated.
Yeah. And the Doors songs too.
Oh,
gosh, yeah. We listened to them, by the way.
Yeah, the intro. I mean, I've done a whole thing for another. So, I did a presentation at the Bath Royal Literary about the book, and I did a long piece on the opening of Apocalypse Now. And the use of the end by the Doors. Yeah. And it's one of the most brilliant openings to a movie, I think, because it's a combination of images, sound. The Jim Morrison's voice with "This Is the End" comes in just as the tree line lights up with napalm. It's extraordinary.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go to the film. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes to tell me why you call The Deer Hunter the best ever Vietnam War film.
Yeah, and I thought very long and hard before putting that in, but in the end, I decided, I have to be honest, it's the one I think is the greatest film to come out, but I do not think it's anything like the most accurate film about Vietnam. I don't think it reflects the real Vietnam experience. I just think as a piece of movie making, it is an absolutely astounding piece of work, largely because of the script and the performances and the directing. It was directed by Michael Cimino. Went way over budget, as all his projects did. But it just struck me as the most powerful. And there were scenes in it that really left me... I said earlier about watching films 40 years on. I saw that when it first came out in 1978, was it 78?
Mm-hmm.
And so watching it more than 40 years later, that was one of them that I just thought, wow, I could show this. In fact, one of my kids have watched it. My adult children hadn't seen it, and they watched it, and they were blown away by it. And I think it's a combination of the performances as much as anything. But I wouldn't for 1 second say it represented the Vietnam experience in any real way. Certainly, I mean, famously the Russian roulette scenes. There's not a single shred of evidence of that ever taking place in Vietnam or anywhere else, as far as I know. So that's fictitious, but obviously it was meant to some kind of symbolic reference to the futility of the whole thing. But there are some individual scenes in it. The scene at the end where they all sing "God Bless America" after the body of Christopher Walken's character is brought home, very controversial at the time. Some people took that as making fun of the American experience and loss in Vietnam. Other people took the diametrically opposite view and thought it was glorifying it, and the fact that it was such a subtle piece of filmmaking to do that. So I'm not going to defend it as the most authentic or anything else. And I think a bigger film as Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now is bigger and has its imprint on the zeitgeist and on the memory of us all is much bigger than the Deer Hunter. But just as a piece of art, I've got to go for the Deer Hunter. It just moved me profoundly.
Yeah. I totally agree with you about the Deer Hunter, especially, I mean, I saw it right when it came out, and I remember to this day, right, it was 1978, I could hardly stand up when the film was over in the theater. It was that powerful to me. And yeah, no, it's on my list too. So, but the opposite of that, as far as verisimilitude is concerned and accuracy, is Platoon. And I know it's high on your list too. I think it's my number one. Can you talk a little bit about that and tell me how it stands in your pantheon and what you think about the realism? Because isn't the realism quotient one of your one on the list of things that you found that war films influenced what came forward after? Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And Platoon, it was interesting from talking to veterans, including yourself, and asking them what these Vietnam films meant to them and how they affected them. Quite a few, they enjoyed Apocalypse Now, but it wasn't anything like their experience of Vietnam. It was maybe
what? No Playboy bunnies? Oh, geez.
Yeah. Although having said that, of course, the Robert Duvall character, poor Robert Duvall, who died recently, his character was based on a real guy, Lieutenant Colonel John B. Stockton, who did play Wagner going into battle. But anyway, but nevertheless, I think it was such a picaresque movie, so many different scenes, and it didn't really reflect anyone's true Vietnam experience. But what so many people said to me was, when I watched Platoon, I just got cold sweats because suddenly I felt like I was back in Vietnam because it was the most authentic. And of course, there's a very good reason for that, which it was number one, it was the first major movie to be directed by a Vietnam veteran in Oliver Stone, and a Vietnam veteran who had seen combat and also been awarded medals for bravery. But also, Stone a guy called Captain Dale Dye, managed to grab an interview with Stone when he was first preparing the film. And I'm sure many of your viewers know Captain Dye was a 3-time Marine veteran of Vietnam. And he'd been, after leaving the military, he was touting this idea around Hollywood that he thought Hollywood did a really bad job of showing what real troops were like. And so he had this idea that he had a way of, he could make the actors feel more like real soldiers. And he was touting this around Hollywood, not getting a hearing it's hard to get a hearing. But because Stone was a fellow Vietnam veteran, he got a 5-minute meeting with him. And that led to another meeting where he convinced Oliver Stone to let him take the entire cast off to the Philippine jungles for a 3-week boot camp where Captain Dye and a couple of his veteran colleagues basically brutalized these poor guys. You had a young Johnny Depp, you had Charlie Sheen, Willem Dafoe. It's a great cast, and they just got put through the mill left, right, and centre. But what it had the effect of doing, I mean, no one's going to say it's the same as being a real combat veteran. You can't replicate that, but it was the closest you're going to get to that, and therefore Platoon opens with a troop plane arriving in Vietnam. You see the soldiers disembarking. Charlie Sheen's there, wide-eyed, looking around. Then there's a hard cut to the guys patrolling in the jungle. And I won't use profanity, but they look like poop. They look terrible.
You can say shit. It's okay.
Yeah. And they had basically come, and that was right at the end of their boot camp. And in fact, the guys on the last night of the boot camp, they had bonded. They had hated it. And then, of course, what happens is they started to love it. They bonded. They lent into the adversity. And I think one of the final exercises, they gave the guys the wrong coordinates and sent them off into the jungle. They deliberately gave them the wrong coordinates, so they had to just survive on their own in the jungle. And of course, they managed to find bananas and pineapples and built bonfires, and they had a great bonding experience. And on the final night, to celebrate, they had a big party, and they all got drunk on a Philippine palm sap liquor called Lampanog, I think it's called. And so the next 6 a.m. the next morning, they were beaten up from the boot camp, heavily hungover. And that's when Oliver Stone and Dale Dye came in and said, "On your feet, we're filming in 1 hour." And that first patrol, where they looked terrible, it's partly because They have been, all their equipment, they've been wearing it for weeks in the jungle. It looks like real soldiers' equipment, everything, every detail. And of course, Dale Dye and his colleagues were attentive to every small detail, what was written on their uniforms, what was written on their helmets, everything looked and felt right. And I think that's why veterans like yourself had an immediate impact on you when you saw those opening scenes.
100%, Joe. I mean, I remember seeing that one too. And I saw it with a bunch of people here at VV. We were invited to a screening before it came, a week before it came out, and we didn't know anything about it. And we were sitting in the audience joking around and what you do after work, and then the lights went down. Man, that very first scene, it was just like quiet. It was a church in there, and we were all that's what every single one of us felt. And by the way, Dale Dye is a member of Vietnam Veterans of America. He was on, I think, the 3rd Dispatches.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, he's great. He's just, I consider him a colleague. He just is a terrific guy and devoted to veterans and devoted to making what you see on film, all the films that he's done. And, he's done World War II films, Band of Brothers, and so many others that he's...
You were kind enough to put me in touch with him for my research.
Yeah.
And honestly, he gave me so much of his time, and his passion just comes through. What a guy. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and he's still doing it. Actually, yeah. He's in the UK actually now doing a movie. Yeah, I'm
going to email him, see if he can see where he is. See if I can go see him.
Yeah.
But of course, that's another way that Hollywood changed, war movies, because that then became the gold standard, and his company, War Inc., became sort of the go-to company to get authenticity into your war film. And then other people have set up and tried to copy it, and some successfully, some less so. But now you don't do any war film that is meant to have any kind of authenticity. You don't do it without taking the approach that Dale Dye pioneered. So, congratulations to him.
Yeah. Well, listen, Joe, we could talk for another hour or so, I think. But and I think we covered most of the highlights. I hope we did. Anything big that I left out that you might want to get across in the last minute or two?
No, the only thing I would say is I do go on about this kind of, I call it the Great Vietnam War movie drought between 1968, Green Berets, and 78 with Deer Hunter coming home. There are, of course, movies in that 10-year period that are about the Vietnam War, but some of them are allegorical. And, I would talk about things like Soldier Blue, which is set in the Old West and kind of is a sort of allegorical of the My Lai Massacre to some degree, although the script was written before the My Lai Massacre was known about, but news of it broke while they were making the film, and it undoubtedly influenced it. I would mention Deliverance, which is Burt Reynolds' film set in America, hillbillies versus some townies go get the wrong side of the hillbillies. MASH, which was very much about the Vietnam War, but was set in Korea, and so there are little jewels in there about the Vietnam War if you want to find them, but they don't necessarily have Vietnam War stamped on the front.
Yeah, MASH is one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm a big Robert Altman fan, but that might have been the first movie of his I saw, but just brilliant, funny, crazy, and great acting and directing. So.
Well, it also led to me, of course, with the surname Houlihan. I got called Hot Lips when Badly, because of Major Margaret Houlihan, not because of any exploits of my own.
Yeah, well, listen, Joe, thank you very much. This was great. The book is Vietnam on the Big Screen. It's just out, and I want to thank you for writing a great book, and thank you for being on Dispatches with us today.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks again for all your help.
You bet. Cheers. How's that?
Cheers. Excellent. That's how we do it.
Take care.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks to the Dispatches team here at Vietnam Veterans of America's National Headquarters. Quentin Butcher, Alfie Williams, the indispensable Daniel Devora, Sean Venables, and myself. Dispatches was created by Michael Keating, and stay tuned soon for the next episode of Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran magazine. We didn't talk about Full Metal Jacket, but that's okay. We didn't talk about a whole bunch of other films. So,
yeah, did you see? So, a couple of days ago, I think yesterday was the birthday of R. Lee Ermey, the late
Lee Ermey, yeah. He was great.
Of course, played that role in The Boys in Company C and then in Pull Up the Jacket, and was basically just playing himself, right?
What was it, Private? What's her name? Did your mother have any children who lived?
Did your parents have any children that lived?
Sir, yes, sir.
I bet they regret that.